Welcome to History 112, Lecture 1, Transformation of the West. By 1877, the West had become quite a large place, because remember, the United States had acquired the Louisiana Territory, had acquired a large amount of land from Mexico, had also settled the border with British Canada and Oregon, and so it was a very big place with diverse lifestyles. And one of the big important groups there are Native Americans. Now, some of the tribes that lived in this territory were nomadic, while others have lived more sedentary lifestyles. And as a result of diverse lifestyles, what was happening by and large in the West was Native American tribes were starting to feel a land shortage starting in about 1831. In other words, there just wasn't enough land to maintain the lifestyles they were living based on the numbers and population. And as more settlers come in, that only further adds stress. And what happens is there's this shift among Native American tribes to where those that tend to be more warlike and are better able to engage in warfare and push settlers out and also gain land for their neighbors, those tribes tend to rise to the top of the complex social structures there. Now, additionally, in the area of the United States that was acquired from Mexico, previously Mexican landowners had enslaved a number of tribes such as Navajo or subdued many of the Pueblo peoples. So there's quite a bit of conflict that's being driven, and a lot of it centers around land and land use, and that's kind of our starting position in 1877. While there is already problems being brought on by competition between Native American tribes, the introduction of more and more settlers coming into these lands is also further straining that. And the most successful group of people when it came to resisting attempts at encroachment on their lands were the Plains tribes. So you're talking about the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and in some cases the Apache. And these groups are very successful. And because they're very successful using military force to keep control of their lands, this tends to lead to these being the most demonized and feared by the white settlers. Now keep in mind at this point, white understanding of Indian nations is extremely limited. White settlers tend to assume all Native Americans are the same. They see no distinction between Sioux and Cheyenne, for example. They assume that all Native American tribes are hostile, and they start to draw a lot of conclusions about them. But the reality is, these are hunters, not soldiers, as the white settlers were painting them. These are tribes that are using warfare to protect their livelihood, not aggressive savages, as sometimes the white settlers would paint them. Despite Native American resistance, white settlers continue to move into these lands, and they engage in a process they call conquering the West. And that's not just a matter of engaging in warfare against Native Americans and pushing them off land. This is a matter of also simply subduing the land itself. Simply getting to these new places was extremely difficult. Prairie grass is very hard to work with, and it's very hard to farm, and so as a result, the plains are going to be the last areas settled simply because they're going to be the hardest places to farm. Now, some areas of the West are already going to be populated by peoples of European descent who already have complex relationships with Native American tribes who inhabit the same regions, and that's very true of the lands gained from Mexico. And when American settlers start to move in, they're already moving into places with complex dynamics and a lot of things that are simply barriers to the settlement that they want to bring with them. And this results in often harsh lifestyles and very difficult circumstances, but also quite a bit of violence with the existing populations that are there. New Mexico is a pretty good example of this. At the beginning of the time period we're talking about, there were already significant farming settlements in this territory, but they amount to about 50,000 people. There are also a significant Native American population that lived there, and who lived in farming settlements by themselves. And essentially you have two existing populations live side by side who had figured out a working system. Now, when this becomes part of the United States, both sides were excluded from government, and the natives rebelled, fearing that there would be a serious change in land distribution and social order brought in by the new white settlers from the United States. As a result of that rebellion, the area ends up being under military rule until 1850, and while the Hispanic elite are going to retain power for some time, by about 1870, corruption has slowly broken their power and status. By the time of the significant waves of immigration come in the area, this ends up being more or less firmly in the hands of white settlers, and the use of military force breaks any remaining resistance from the Native American tribes. As we explore the American West, we should keep in mind that what Mexico had called California was actually the modern day states of Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, and of course California itself. Now, into this region, large numbers of non-Spanish speakers have begun to migrate there in the early 1800s, and within Mexican California, there becomes differentiation between the true original settlers and these new settlers from largely the United States. But the Californios, that are known, quickly become outnumbered by the 1830s, and that's a factor that's going to play heavily into Mexico's loss of California in the war between Mexico and the United States in 1846 and 1847. The original Spanish settlement in California grew up around the mission system, wherein church-run settlements would attempt to convert the native population and often used forced labor tactics. This was followed by a secular ranch system in about the 1830s, and the non-native population in Mexican California never grew very large. And the large number of settlers flooding into the United States quickly become the majority. And once that happens, the Spanish speaking population was often treated as second class citizens. While the Spanish speaking population did manage to retain control over Southern California for a while, serious droughts and financial crises bankrupted most of the wealthy ranchers, and that allowed new waves of settlers to take control of the region. In addition to the white settlers coming from the United States into California, there was also a famine in China that leads to a large migration across the Pacific to places such as Hawaii, Australia, South America, and so on. And people in China began settling in Mexican California in the early 1820s, and their numbers are going to grow significantly after the 1840s gold rush. The white mine owners who come in at that time are needing cheap labor and often employing them, and there's a lot of opportunities for work on the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. However, resistance to Chinese immigration grows as the numbers increase and those immigrants begin to prosper. In simple terms, we can draw a parallel between the anti-Chinese racism in California and the anti-African American racism back east. Some examples of that would be in 1852, California levies a tax on non-white mine owners to discourage Chinese entrepreneurship. Chinese workers on the Transcontinental Railroad were treated very badly and often cruelly to discourage them from remaining in the United States after the completion of the railroad. In 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, a lot of people expected Chinese workers to leave and return to China, and there was a lot of pressure put on them to do so. But instead, they largely flocked to West Coast cities and established many Chinatowns. And these original Chinatowns were as much a feature of self-protection as anything else. They could establish a community where their culture could thrive and where they felt relatively safe. And that was not the case in many of the settlements along the way as the railroad had been being built and being finished. In addition, newspapers at this time began to speak of what they called the Yellow Peril. This was the large population of Chinese people in California's larger cities, and this type of thing often provoked outright violence against these individuals. In 1882, Congress goes ahead and acts based on this race-based fear and passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which bans any further Chinese immigration from 1882 until 1892. For the duration of that act, it also meant that any Chinese person who was in the United States who had not already applied for citizenship could not do so during this term. Congress also then extends the act for another 10 years from 1892 until 1902, and then in 1902 they go ahead and make it permanent, and it's not until World War II this gets repealed. In looking at the population of the West, the last thing we need to think about is the Homestead Act of 1862. And this act gives 160 acres of land to any person who would live on it and farm it for at least 5 years, and they simply had to pay a small fee to register the title in their name, and that fee usually came down to about 4 acres for $1. Unfortunately, a lot of land in the West is not suitable for farming, and over time, more homesteads were abandoned than settled. The Homestead Act of 1862 also makes the West by far the most culturally diverse section of the United States, but that social equality is really most obvious among the poor and landless. And what we have to understand is this. Within an economic class like the poor and landless, there were still distinctions of culture, race, language, national background, and all of that, but they were nowhere near as pronounced as they would be on the East Coast. So in other words, on the West Coast, economic class matters when it comes to social barriers by a far greater factor than anything else. Now, when it comes to the difference between rich and poor, however, that very much resembles what's taking place on the East Coast. So economic class matters the way it does on the East Coast. Other cultural factors, not as big of a deal in the West. The Western economy changed drastically after the Civil War. Most commercial activity during this time relied heavily on short-term paid labor, and unemployment was very common, with wages being low and poor working conditions. Men in this area tend to wander from place to place looking for work, and just like on the East Coast, the ability of someone to start off as being very poor and work their way up to rich while theoretically present had so many barriers as to make it impractical. The Western economy was also dominated by cycles of boom and bust, and the first cycle begins with the gold rush of 1849. And as soon as the easily accessible deposits of gold and other valuable metals were exhausted, mining camps were abandoned. However, more permanent settlers came in following them, and farmers and ranchers who moved in those next waves took advantage of the infrastructure set up to support the mining. In other words, these temporary mining camps had done things like clear roads, and then they were abandoned. Well, when the ranchers came in, those same roads that had existed to bring supplies in and out of the mining camps, as well as bring the gold out of the mining camps, those were then available for these ranchers and farmers to derive economic benefit from. Boomtowns also tend to grow up around mining camps and offers various services. Boomtown economies tend to revolve around drinking, gambling, food service, hardware, transportation, and prostitution. Miners within these towns tend to spend the money just as fast as they make it. Now, merchants, on the other hand, tend to become rich. So, in other words, the miners tend to end up no better off for their labor, but the merchants that were selling them supplies and providing them services, they tend to make a killing. Now, these boomtowns were often relatively lawless, and order tended to be enforced by vigilante committees. The overwhelming majority of populations of mining towns tended to be male, and single men often found it difficult or impossible to meet a single woman their own age. When women do move to mining towns, they tend to come with their husbands. Single women could also find quite a bit of employment in domestic pursuits such as cooking or laundry should they choose to move there, and prostitution was often legal and generally accepted in most of these places. While boomtowns and mining are important to the economy of certain areas of the West, other areas rely on cattle ranches, and Texas is a good example of that. Now, the large ranches that had developed prior to independence there survived through the Civil War, and these ranches tend to have large herds that roam semi-wild and were tended by cowboys. Now, the rising demand and price for meat on the East Coast are going to begin to lead to what's called the long drives, where these whole herds of cattle will be driven across open territory towards the railroads several hundred miles away. And on these long drives, large amounts of cattle do not survive, but the herds are so large that even with the losses, this can lead to significant and sometimes massive profits. Now, the cowboys attended these by the 1870s were made up of former Confederate soldiers, being the largest group, followed by African Americans, then Tejanos, and people from Mexico who had recently immigrated. So they were a diverse group of individuals. Now, as this continues on and more people flood in and the cattle industry becomes more and more profitable, there's increased competition for grazing land, and that leads to a series of range wars. As the cattle industry booms, investors from around the world are also going to be tempted in by huge profits, and soon the land becomes overstocked and cannot support all the head of cattle. In addition, the long drives did not have adequate grazing land along the way, so a lot of cattle starved. In other words, the first few herds to come through, the cows would be able to eat, but those who came through afterwards, there was simply nothing left for their cows to graze on, and those herds could face severe losses. Now, when you combine all that with a couple of bad seasons in a row, the cattle industry is decimated. Many farmers around this time start to turn also to barbed wire to keep roaming cattle from grazing on their land. Ranchers also start to turn to fencing to protect their land and begin to use hay to supplement the cattle's diet during the winter. And those are some of the steps they take to simply recover from this overstocking the land. Then, in addition, with the railroads expanding, that ultimately ends the trails and the wandering herds of cattle as the railway now becomes very close to the ranch. And that's also going to kill the cowboy lifestyle. That entire cowboy era that's mythologized in movies is really only about 10 years long. Now, in the West, women's rights are also going to advance quite a bit further than they do in the East quite a bit earlier on. Wyoming is going to be the first state to guarantee voting rights for women. Utah is also going to do this very early on. Part of the motivation within Utah is the predominant faith is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, and they have been widely criticized during this time about polygamy, and this became an important way to show that women were treated with, in at least one respect, better within this state than they were in the East. So it becomes something of a political thing for this society. Now, Western women are also going to exercise large amounts of political control and will also hold elected offices. So, in the West, it is somewhat of a more egalitarian society. It is far from being true equality, but there's simply more opportunity for groups that have been historically discriminated against in the West than there was in the East. Or to say another way, there were small opportunities in the West, there were no opportunities in the East. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad also brings significant changes to this area because it captures the public imagination and it also makes transport to the West practical. You no longer had to go by covered wagon, and you could simply ride in the comfort of a rail car. In addition, railways and spur lines are going to be funded by the government to encourage economic growth, so the railroad is going to suddenly start going everywhere. And this is also being fueled by huge incentives that are provided in terms of loans and land to railroads. And while this is going to lead to significant growth, it is essentially using public funds to allow private companies to expand and become extremely rich. And that becomes controversial at the time because what the government is doing is sponsoring one group against another. And when we talk about the populists a little later on, this is something that we need to realize is that the government put huge amounts of wealth and money in the hands of one group at the expense of another. Now, Western farming is going to face major challenges, and the drought is going to plague farmers in the late 1880s. New techniques will help them survive, but the capital for major irrigation systems was not available to them, and there was no government assistance. And again, we will be talking about the populace later on, and these are significant issues here. Now, when you throw in that drought and falling grain prices, this causes widespread abandonment of farms. And a lot of settlers will going to start moving back east, and many communities turn into ghost towns, even in areas we don't necessarily associate with them, like the Midwest. In response to all this, you're seeing a greater reliance on commercial farming, where these farmers are going to grow cash crops rather than food for personal consumption. Now, what happens though is worldwide overproduction is going to cause a collapse in agricultural business. Farmers are going to become very disgruntled. Prices are going to fall. Heavy loan burdens are going to tax them to the point of economic collapse. And they're going to turn to the government demanding relief. And when that doesn't happen, we're going to see a new political party called the Populists emerge. And we'll talk about them in detail a little bit later on. So, what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, the mixing of this new wave of settlers with the existing population means conflict. Sometimes that conflict is violent, and ultimately it's going to be settled with military force. But this is going to create a highly diverse population, and that's going to mean greater opportunity. But that opportunity is far, far from equal. Farmers are going to become an important group, but also face real economic hardship, and that's going to have long term consequences that we'll be revisiting very soon. See you in the next lecture.